I still remember the first time I met Rob. It was late summer, the sticky kind of hot that made everything feel heavier. My old apartment lease was up, and I'd been scrambling to find a new place to live. It wasn't the best time, I'll admit. I'd just broken up with my boyfriend of 3 years, and on top of that, work had been sucking the life out of me. I needed something simple, something quick, so I turned to the internet. Craigslist, of all places. After a couple of dead ends and some weird responses, I found Rob's listing. His ad was neat, straight to the point, room for rent, clean, respectful roommate, utilities included, quiet area. The price was too good to pass up, especially for a city like this. We exchanged a few emails, and he seemed, well, normal. Better than normal, even friendly. He offered to do a virtual tour, said he worked from home most days, so his schedule was flexible. We video called that afternoon, and he walked me through the apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had a nice charm to it. Hardwood floors, decent kitchen, and the bedroom looked spacious enough. Rob himself seemed fine. Mid-30s, clean-cut, dark hair, athletic build. He was the kind of guy who looked like he probably ran marathons or something. He smiled a lot, which put me at ease. It was just the two of us on the call, and I could tell he'd done this before. He asked about my work, my schedule, the usual small talk. We hit it off well enough. After a while, I decided to take the plunge and agreed to meet him in person the following weekend. The day I went over to sign the lease was unremarkable. I'd convinced myself it was going to be awkward, but Rob made it easy. He greeted me at the door with that same smile, his handshake firm but not overbearing. The apartment looked just like it had in the video, clean, spacious, with a slight smell of pine cleaner in the air. I was relieved. I'd been imagining some Craigslist horror story, but everything checked out. "Glad you could make it," Rob said, motioning me inside. "Feel free to look around again before you sign anything. I want you to be sure." I did. I wandered around the apartment, checking the kitchen cupboards, peeking into the bathroom. Everything looked normal, and Rob stayed out of my way, giving me space to explore. When I returned to the living room, he handed me the lease. We sat down at the small dining table while I read through it. There wasn't anything weird in the paperwork, just the standard stuff. Rent due on the 1st of the month, quiet hours after 10 p.m., no pets. Rob made small talk while I signed. He told me about his job in IT, how he mostly worked from home, and how he liked to keep the apartment quiet and clean. "We'll get along great," he said with that same smile. "I don't have many friends over, and I'm usually out on the weekends. It'll be like having the place to yourself most of the time." I moved in a week later, excited to settle into this new chapter of my life. At first, things were fine. Rob was easy to live with. He kept to himself like he promised. We'd see each other in the mornings, exchange a few pleasantries over coffee, and then go about our days. He worked from his bedroom most of the time, and I'd hear him tapping away on his keyboard or talking quietly on his phone during conference calls. The apartment stayed clean, and true to his word, he was hardly around on weekends. But then, things started to shift. It was subtle at first. Little things you wouldn't normally notice unless you were paying attention. Rob would linger a bit too long when we talked, his eyes not quite meeting mine, but hovering just below, like he was scanning me. I brushed it off, told myself I was being paranoid, that I was overthinking it. He was friendly, maybe a little awkward, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest as I lay there in the dark, holding my breath. The door only opened a crack, just wide enough for me to see the faint outline of someone standing there. The hallway light was off, and the room was pitch black, but I knew it was him, Rob. I could feel his presence. My body went cold, and I didn't move an inch. For what felt like an eternity, neither did he. Finally, after what must have been a minute or two, the door closed again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a bad dream. I hadn't locked the door, and it must have swung open on its own, right? I tried to push it out of my mind, but the uneasy feeling lingered. I started locking my door at night, just to be safe. But that didn't stop the paranoia from creeping in. Rob started getting bolder. It was little things at first. He'd stand too close to me in the kitchen, his arm brushing against mine, or he'd casually ask if I had plans for the night, a little too invested in my answer. His smile was always there, but it started to feel forced, like a mask he was struggling to keep up. And then there were the times I'd come home to find things in my room just off. Nothing major, but I'd noticed the slight shift in how my things were arranged. My dresser drawers would be slightly ajar, or my closet door would be open just an inch when I was sure I'd closed it that morning. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that maybe I'd just been careless, but deep down, I knew. I knew Rob had been in my room. It was the third time I came home to find my bedroom window wide open that I couldn't ignore it anymore. I always kept it shut, but there it was, open, the curtain blowing slightly in the evening breeze. I didn't confront him that night. I was too scared. And honestly, I wasn't even sure what I would say. But things were building, slowly. The air in the apartment felt heavier, more oppressive. Rob's friendliness became too familiar, too invasive. He'd casually mention things he shouldn't have known, small details about my day or my schedule that I hadn't shared with him. I started feeling trapped in my own home, always on edge, always waiting for the next thing to happen. And then, I found the underwear. I came home late that night. It had been one of those exhausting work days where everything that could go wrong did. I kicked off my shoes by the door, desperate to change into something comfortable. My room, as always, was neat and orderly. I'm particular about my space, and it helps me stay sane. But as I rifled through my dresser for a clean pair of pajamas, my hand brushed against an empty space in the back of the drawer where my underwear should have been. At first, I thought I'd just miscounted. Maybe I was out of laundry or had misplaced them somewhere, but deep down, something felt wrong. I dug through the drawer, pulling out every piece of clothing, trying to convince myself I was being ridiculous. But the truth was staring me right in the face. They were missing. Several pairs of my underwear were just gone. I stood there, frozen, a sick feeling churning in my stomach. My immediate thought was that maybe I'd misplaced them, left them in the laundry room or something. But the more I thought about it, the more impossible that seemed. I always put everything back in the same spot, folded neatly and organized. And then the reality hit me. Rob, I remembered the strange, fleeting moments, the times I'd come home to find my things slightly out of place, the bedroom door unlocked when I knew I'd locked it. I had brushed it off, chalked it up to my own forgetfulness, but now there was no denying it. Someone had been in my room. And it wasn't just anyone, it was Rob. My heart raced as I tried to think of what to do. I wanted to confront him, to scream at him, but a deep fear stopped me. Rob wasn't just my roommate. He had access to every part of my life now. He knew when I came home, when I left for work, and most disturbingly, he had been inside my most private space. Rifling through my things, stealing my underwear. The thought made my skin crawl. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every creak and rustle in the apartment making me jump. I kept expecting to hear my bedroom door creak open again, like that first night, but it never did. By morning, I'd made a decision. I was going to install a lock on my door, one that Rob didn't have a key to. It wasn't much, but it would give me some sense of security, at least until I could figure out my next step. The next day, I went to the hardware store and bought a deadbolt lock. I spent the afternoon installing it, carefully screwing it into place while trying to keep my hands from shaking. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched, like Rob was somewhere nearby, lurking. But he was out, or at least I thought he was. It wasn't until later that night, when he came home, that the confrontation I'd been dreading finally happened. I was sitting on the couch, trying to distract myself with some mindless TV, when the front door opened and Rob walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just gave me his usual tight-lipped smile before heading toward his room. But then he stopped, turned, and looked directly at me. "You put a lock on your door," he said. His voice was calm, but there was something behind it, something dark, simmering just beneath the surface. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, I needed some extra privacy." Rob didn't move. He stood there, staring at me for what felt like an eternity, that strange smile still on his face. "You don't trust me?" The question caught me off guard, and for a second, I didn't know how to respond. The truth was, no, I didn't trust him. Not anymore. But I couldn't say that. I couldn't provoke him. It's not that, I lied. I feel better with a lock, you know, personal space and all that. He took a step closer, and I felt the tension in the room ratchet up several notches. My hands gripped the edge of the couch cushion, my pulse quickening. You didn't seem to need one before, he said, his voice lowering. What changed? I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Rob's eyes were locked on mine, his expression unreadable. He wasn't smiling anymore. Look, it's not a big deal, I finally managed to say, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. I just feel more comfortable this way. Rob stood there for a moment longer, his gaze drilling into me, before he finally nodded, just once. Fine, he said quietly, but I don't like feeling shut out, you know? I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything. He stared at me for another beat, then turned and walked into his room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For the next few days, things were tense but quiet. Rob kept to himself, barely speaking to me, but I could feel his presence everywhere. He was always just on the other side of the wall, listening, watching. The lock on my door gave me a false sense of security. I knew that, but it was all I had. Then one evening, I came home to find a note taped to my bedroom door. It was written in neat, precise handwriting. We need to talk. Tonight. My stomach twisted into knots. I knew it was from Rob. I debated ignoring it, locking myself in my room and pretending I hadn't seen the note, but something about it unnerved me. There was no way I could just pretend this wasn't happening. That night, after dinner, I sat on the couch, waiting for Rob to make his move. Sure enough, he appeared a few minutes later, standing in the doorway to the living room, his hands in his pockets. Can we talk? He asked, his tone soft, almost pleading. I didn't want to, but I nodded. Sure. Rob sat down across from me, his eyes fixed on mine. There was a strange intensity about him, like he was trying to hold something back, but just barely. I don't like what's been happening between us, he began. I feel like you're distancing yourself. I didn't know how to respond. I need space, I said carefully. He leaned forward, his expression hardening. Space from what? The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. I could feel the walls closing in, his gaze pinning me in place. Rob, Before I could finish, there was a knock at the door. We both turned toward the sound, and my heart leapt into my throat. It was late. Too late for visitors. I stood up, my legs trembling as I made my way to the door, hoping it was just a neighbor or a package delivery. But when I opened it, I found a woman standing there, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. Don't trust him, she whispered, her voice shaking. Rob, he's dangerous. I stared at her, my mind racing. What do you mean? He's done this before, she said quickly, glancing over her shoulder as if she expected someone to be watching. He's had restraining orders filed against him. Stalking, harassment. You need to get out. Now. Rob was standing right behind me now, and I could feel his presence looming over me. I didn't dare turn around. The woman's eyes met mine, pleading. Please, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, before it's too late. I stood there frozen, the woman's words echoing in my mind. He's dangerous. The weight of her warning hit me like a cold punch to the gut. Rob was standing behind me, so close that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. My throat tightened, but I couldn't let him see how scared I was. Not yet. I turned to look at Rob. His face was unreadable, but I knew he'd heard every word. His eyes flicked to the woman standing in the doorway, and for a brief second, something flashed across his face. Anger? Fear? I couldn't tell. Who is she? Rob asked, his voice steady but colder than I'd ever heard it. The woman didn't answer. She took a step back, her eyes darting between Rob and me, like she was calculating how much time she had before things went bad. I'm just leaving, she said quickly, her voice trembling. I needed to warn her. Before either of us could respond, she turned and hurried down the hallway, disappearing around the corner. I wanted to run after her, to follow her out of the building, and never come back. But I was rooted to the spot, trapped by the tension between Rob and me. What was that about? Rob asked, his tone flat, but there was an edge to it now. His eyes were locked on mine, demanding answers. I swallowed hard, trying to think of something, anything that would diffuse the situation. I don't know, I lied. I've never seen her before. Rob's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought he was going to call me out. But then he let out a slow breath and forced a smile. "People are weird," he muttered, shaking his head, "always sticking their noses where they don't belong." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to process what the woman had said. Restraining orders, stalking. It all made sense now, the strange behavior, the creeping violations of my privacy, the way Rob seemed to know things about me that I'd never told him. I needed to get out. But how? Rob was watching me more closely than ever now. He'd probably be listening to every sound, waiting for me to make a move. I couldn't just pack up and leave in the middle of the night without arousing suspicion. I had to be smart about this. Careful. The rest of the evening was tense. Rob retreated to his room after a while, but I knew he wasn't really gone. The door to his bedroom was slightly ajar, and every so often I'd catch a glimpse of him watching me from the shadows. I didn't dare make eye contact, didn't dare give him any reason to suspect that I knew what he was capable of. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every groan of the apartment building made me jump. I kept imagining Rob creeping down the hallway, standing outside my door, waiting for the right moment to do whatever it was he had planned. The deadbolt on my door gave me some comfort, but not much. I knew if Rob really wanted to get in, he would find a way. The next morning, I decided to call the police. I waited until Rob left for his morning run, a routine I'd memorized by now. He was usually out for an hour, maybe a little longer on days when he ran farther. As soon as I heard the door close behind him, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. When the operator picked up, I explained the situation as calmly as I could, trying to keep my voice from shaking. I told them about Rob's increasingly bizarre behavior, about the woman who'd come to my door and warned me about his past. The operator transferred me to a detective who seemed to take my concerns seriously. He asked me for Rob's full name and any details I had about him. I gave him everything I knew, feeling a sick sense of dread settle over me as I spoke. I didn't have much information, just his first name, some vague details about his job in IT, and the apartment address. But it was enough. The detective told me they'd look into Rob's history and send a patrol car by the building, just in case. He advised me to get out as soon as I could. I thanked him and hung up, my hands trembling as I clutched the phone. I had a sinking feeling that calling the police had only made things worse. Rob was smart, too smart. He'd know something was up if the cops came snooping around. And if they didn't find anything conclusive in his record, he'd know I'd tried to involve the authorities. I needed to move fast. I packed my bags that day, trying to keep my movements as casual as possible. I told myself that Rob wouldn't be home until later, that I had time to gather my things and get out before he noticed. But every sound made me jump. Every minute felt like a countdown to disaster. By mid-afternoon, I had everything ready. I shoved my essentials into a duffel bag and slung it over my shoulder, my heart pounding in my chest. I just needed to make it out the door. But as I reached for the doorknob, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of keys jingling in the lock. Rob was back. Panic shot through me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I ran to my room and locked the door, my hands shaking so badly that I fumbled with the deadbolt. I heard Rob enter the apartment, his footsteps slow and deliberate, like he was searching for something or someone. I pressed myself against the door, trying to quiet my breathing as his footsteps grew louder, closer. Then, silence. He was standing right outside my room. A soft knock on the door made my heart stop. "Hey," Rob called through the door, his voice calm, almost gentle. "What's going on? Why's the door locked?" I couldn't answer. I couldn't move. I stood there, paralyzed, my mind racing with every horrible possibility of what could happen next. "I know you're in there," he said after a moment, his voice dropping. "You can't hide from me." The threat in his words was unmistakable. And then, just as I thought he might try to force his way in, I heard it. Sirens, faint at first, but growing louder. The police were here. Rob must have heard them too, because he suddenly went quiet. I waited, my heart pounding in my ears, as the sirens drew closer. Then, there was a loud knock on the front door. Rob didn't move. He was frozen in place, caught between whatever he had planned and the reality that was now crashing down on him. The knock came again, louder this time. "Police? Open up." Rob finally moved. I heard him walk away from my door, his footsteps heavy as he went to answer. I didn't dare leave my room. I stayed there, crouched on the floor, listening to the muffled voices at the front of the apartment. After what felt like hours, there was a knock on my bedroom door. "It's safe now," a voice called. "You can come out." I slowly unlocked the door, my hands still trembling. When I stepped out, 2 police officers stood in the hallway. One of them gave me a reassuring nod. "Rob's gone," the officer said. "We're taking him in for questioning. We'll need you to come down to the station to give a statement." I nodded, barely able to process what was happening. Rob was gone, but the fear still lingered. It would be a long time before I felt safe again. As I left the apartment with the officers, I couldn't help but think about the woman who had warned me. She had been right all along. Rob wasn't just a bad roommate, he was something much worse. And I had been lucky to escape before things got out of hand. But even as I walked away, a part of me knew this wasn't over. Not really. Rob might be gone for now, but the fear he'd planted in me, that would stay.